So, in an article published earlier this year, José Luis de las Heras Santos analyzed the issue of scandals in the Spanish monarchy of the early modern period through the judicial documentation from the Crown of Castile. Based on this documentation, de las Heras Santos identified 4 types of scandals: those caused by religious transgressions, the ones that deal with transgressions of the family order, such as adultery, concubinage, homosexuality, prostitution, etc. Scandalous transgressions against the legal and institutional system, and finally all disruptions to public order, which by their very nature were already deemed scandalous. The work of de las Heras Santos, together with the article by Enrique Álvarez Cora dedicated to the legal concept of scandal in the 16th 18th centuries, are the only studies that have specifically addressed this issue in the context of early modern Spain. Obviously, in the recent years, numerous historians have studied countless cases of corruption in early modern Spain. However, none of them have specifically addressed 2 of the questions we are tackling today: the scandal these cases provoked and the process of scandalization experienced by corrupt officers. In this regard, one might question the reasons behind Spanish historiography's apparent lack of interest in the scandalization of corrupt officers. An hypothetical answer to this question is perhaps twofold. Next slide, if you can. On the one hand, if we examine the frequency with which the concept of corruption scandal is used in books, we observe that it is a relatively recent idea that does not appear or skyrocket until the early 1980s. On the other hand, the novelty of the concept of corruption scandal itself indicates that it is not a term we would find in primary sources from the early modern period. Instead, it is a neologism employed by social scientists to describe a specific political phenomenon of contemporary times. Therefore, we must ask to what extent it constitutes a valid analytical category for studying events that took place in the past. From our perspective, although the term corruption scandal was not used in its literal sense, it can still be employed as an analytical category to study a type of phenomenon that occurred within past societies, namely public protest and indignation arising from the corrupt practices of public officials. Hence, in the following minutes, we will attempt to demonstrate that scandals arising from cases of corruption indeed represent a highly relevant field of study for the early modern period, and more specifically, in our case, for the Principality of Catalonia as well. First, it is, next slide, I think. First, it is worth noting that while there are few studies analyzing the notion of scandal in the context of early modern Spain, in the case of early modern Catalonia, the absence of such works is absolute. To address this lack of hermeneutic foundation, a good starting point would be to determine the Catalan historical meanings of the term scandal. In this regard, according to the Catalan, Valencian, Balearic dictionary, the word scandal was used in early modern Catalonia in 2 main senses. First, it referred to actions that offended others' moral sensibilities or public acts deemed morally wrong. And second, it related to unrest, disturbances of public order, shouting, or the noise of quarrels and disagreements. To these 2 theoretical meanings, a third one, derived from political practice, must be added. The association of the term scandal with the idea of public indignation at practices by public officers that society considered corrupt. In all 3 cases, however, it is evident that we are dealing with a phenomenon that seeks and requires publicity, thriving and unfolding in the public sphere. Several examples of these 3 cases can be found in early modern Catalonia. Regarding the first sense, offending others' moral sensibilities, which in turn could relate to mechanisms of accountability for public officers, One notable case is the prosecution of Luis Puig, a member of the City Council of the city of Barcelona, in 1619. Puig was accused of abusing his office to gain access to the Casa de las Rapaneridas in order to obtain the services of some of the women living there. The Casa de las Rapaneridas was a residence where women involved in prostitution as well as adulteresses and victims of sexual assault were confined. This act caused, in the words of the prosecution during the accountability proceedings against Luis Puig, I quote, great scandal among the townsfolk and neighbors, end quote. For the reason, it was argued that, quote, these crimes and excesses are worthy of great punishment and chastisement, end quote. Regarding the second sense of scandal, understood as causing a public uproar, the concept is closely linked to political tensions and even interinstitutional conflicts. For instance, during the Catalan Parliament of 1599, various grievances were presented concerning the attempted capture of Joan Granollers, one of the leaders of the Generalitat of Catalonia during the 1590-1593 triennium. In fact, Granollers himself explained in the grievance he submitted personally that when he withdrew to the palace of the Generalitat to escape the king's officers, who were actually pursuing him for political reasons, he did so ostensibly to, quote, calm all scandals, end quote, referring to the popular unrest that erupted in Barcelona's Montcada street that day, unrest that ultimately facilitated his escape. Political scandals, in fact, were quite common. Beyond the case just mentioned, if we examine the main events in Catalan politics during the 16th and 17th centuries, it becomes fairly straightforward to trace a continuous thread running from one political scandal to the next. This thread stretches from the initial tensions between the Generalitat and the Inquisition in the mid-16th century to the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. Finally, we can also observe the concept of scandal associated with the public indignation emerging from corruption practices performed by public officers. A paradigmatic example is the case brought against Uno Vila, again, consular of the city of Barcelona. His actions were carried out, quote, with such great scandal and publicity that even the children were singing about it in the streets, end quote. During this term as consular of Barcelona between 1632 and 1633, Vila engaged primarily in the sale of city offices in exchange, obviously, for money, a practice that was strictly prohibited in Barcelona. This conduct was described as bribery in the accusation brought forward during the prosecution of the Visita against him in 1634. In any case, it is important to acknowledge that while political scandals appear to have been fairly common phenomenon in the early modern Principality of Catalonia, mainly as a result of tensions between royal institutions and local authorities, scandals related to cases of corruption seem to have been less prevalent, at least until the implementation of the Nueva Planta Decree in 1716. In the absence of an exhaustive study of this phenomenon, we think it would be reasonable to propose the hypothesis that the mechanisms of oversight for public officials serve as a way to channel public discontent over such actions in a systematic manner. Consequently, these mechanisms may have weakened the foundation for potential corruption scandals. Indeed, one of the defining characteristics of scandals is their exceptional nature. When a situation becomes routine, it ceases to surprise and ultimately to scandalize population. In 16th and 17th century Catalonia, anti-corruption measures were an integral part of institutional routine. If we examine the Catalan institutional framework prior to 1714, we can observe that at least 4 bodies were tasked with holding public officers accountable. The table trial and the visit of the royal officers regarding royal officers, the Visita General affecting the officers of the Generalitat de Catalunya, and the Visita del Consell de Cent affecting the officials of the city of Barcelona. Given this context, our hypothesis is that the certainty of periodic accountability mechanisms made the use of scandal and scandalization of corrupt officers far less necessary. In fact, those who generated or endured the most tensions, namely the royal officers, were distinguished by the fact that the systems meant to oversee them were the least consistent in adhering to the periodicity theoretically stipulated by Catalan laws. This entire political reality would change significantly following the Catalan defeat in the War of Spanish Succession between 1701 and 1715. As is well known, the Nueva Planta Decree of 1716, introduced by Philip V of Spain, not only suppressed Catalonia's unique political system and replaced it with the governmental structure typical of the Crown of Castile, but it also, and this is very important, failed to implement Castile's mechanisms for overseeing public officers. Catalonia was instead treated as a permanently militarized territory under a state of siege, where holding monarchy officials accountable was deemed unnecessary. As David will elaborate shortly, this new political and institutional context created fertile ground for the emergence of corruption scandals. Anti-corruption, which had been an institutional routine, became non-existent or at best an exceptional occurrence until the mid-century.
Well, thank you. I first would like to rapidly thank the organization for letting me present today this work. As previously stated by Ricard, the lack of control and accounting mechanisms, such as the end-of-term juicio de residencia in those new local and regional offices created by the reforms of 1714 and 1718, became the breeding ground for the generalization of corrupt practices. In addition, the Crown's appointment of lifelong councillors and the cessation of the annual sortition of town officials also entrenched local elites in power, especially those formed by those who remained loyal to Philip V during the War of the Spanish Succession, as Ricard has also said. These officials initially were unpaid and later poorly compensated, but they got to manage key fiscal and administrative tasks, including the distribution of the new catastro tax introduced in the subdued territories of the old Crown of Aragon. Also, they controlled the local monopolies, such as food provisioning, tolls, or the control of communal lands and forests. And thus, this became a source of mismanagement and exacerbated irregularities in the municipal government. Similarly, corregidores, which were the regional military commanders appointed after Catalonia's division in 12 corregimientos, or regions, in the map as you can see, in 1718, also faced delayed salary payments from the financially struggling towns under their jurisdiction. Thus, many turned into illicit means of enrichment, let's say it that way, leveraging their judicial and military authority to engage in abusive and fraudulent practices. This climate of perceived corruption, overtaxation and extortion prompted the townsfolk to seek recourse through their guilds, which were the only representative institution retained under the Nueva Planta administration. From the 1740s onwards, guild representatives increasingly reported the situation, this situation of perceived corruption, to the Real Audiencia, which was the regional high court in Barcelona, documenting constant abuses by councillors and corregidores. These reports highlighted the widespread grievances all over Catalonia, included inflating fees, unequal tax distribution, and monopolistic exploitation. Aside from this collective action, the undisguised corrupt practices also triggered a broader public response from the same local population in what we can describe as corruption scandals in the terms stated by Ricard. Generally, this kind of popular outrage took the form of the publication of anonymous graffitis, satires, or lampoons placed on the streets or in nearby shops or taverns. This public display of disagreement often triggered a faster response from military and judicial officials, always suspicious of the populace because of the rebellious nature attributed to Catalan folk. These judges of the Real Audiencia recorded several of those scandals between 1724 and 1768, and we have compiled some of them in the following map, as you can see in here. While most of them solely consisted in the publication of set anonymous satires, usually signed by, and I quote, the poor people of the town, combined with the following collective action led by guild representatives, there are other examples in which public unrest incited and, by this alleged corruption, almost led to an open revolt against the local authorities. For example, in 1743, in Cervera, a conflict in Cervera culminated in a public demonstration called by bell ringing and gunfire, which were both actions strictly forbidden since 1714. While the councillors were prosecuted for tax mismanagement and later pardoned by the High Court, the protest leaders were faced detention and also were exiled from the same town. Similar incidents occurred in smaller towns like Balianes there and Valls here in the year 1760, where enraged citizens physically attacked officials, forcing them to flee the city and go to a nearby place where royal troops could protect them. These events highlighted the growing intersection between the popular outrage and the collective guild action as means of resisting these perceived injustices. One of the most significant examples of such resistance took place in Mataró, which was the third largest port city in Catalonia, where tensions picked up because of military conscription imposed by Nueva Planta. There, the guilds opposed the draft and resisted in organizing the lotteries, a defiance that was met with severe reprisals. In 1754, Corregidor Oroncio Bretella accused the guilds of inciting disturbances and colluding with a lawyer to mobilize the armed townspeople against him and the council. This marked the rise of an informal opposition movement led by the guilds who accused local officials of corruption, overtaxing and prosecution. Their actions included legal complaints and also public defiance, such as the painting of a graffiti targeting the authorities. They painted a sausage on the door in the corregidor's house, saying that he was like a sausage. This also provoked a harsh crackdown, with some of the guild leaders arrested for organizing sacred meetings. Amid those escalating conflicts in Mataró and elsewhere, of course, the Crown introduced several municipal reforms, creating new oversighting roles, such as the Síndico Procurador General in 1716, or the Síndicos and Diputados del Común in 1766, to try to curb corruption. However, these reforms faced several challenges, including, especially, the interference from local elites and the factionalism in elections. The guild's persistence ultimately led Betrella's downfall in 1766, after he was discovered to be the leader of a smuggling scheme, ending his 39-year tenure as corregidor. But despite this victory of the guilds, the Council of Castile issued a measured resolution against the councillors in 1767 and discouraged further guild involvement in local governance, warning against the dangers of fomenting public turmoil, always reminiscent of the famous Esquilache riots of 1766. The Esquilache riots also led to the expulsion of the Society of Jesus from the Spanish territories, and also the confiscation of their assets. Those confiscated assets were managed by special boards created in each town that used to have a Jesuit community until 1760s. The mismanagement by some of those boards sparked also public outrage, forcing provincial authorities to act against them. This was the case of Manresa, a case that we will briefly explain, in which those three types of scandals that Ricard has described collude one with the other, and we think it could be an illustrative case of such dynamics. Manresa was a city that used to have one of the largest Jesuit communities in Catalonia, and since April 1767, Alcalde Mayor, which was the helper, well, it's an office associated with the corregidor and helps him in judicial matters, Alcalde Mayor Jerónimo Vago became the officer who led this ward in charge of maintaining and managing all the Jesuit assets of the city. And only 7 months later, an anonymous lampoon appeared at his house and accused him of being, and I quote, the biggest thief from Sierra Morena. Here you have it highlighted in Spanish in the original document, and it was a reference obvious to his Andalusian origin. And because of such, and I quote, disturbance of the public peace and of the repeated grievances of the common folk, quote, the local corregidor and the councillors presented a report to the Real Audiencia in Barcelona denouncing Vago's corrupt practices and abuse of authority. Besides from profiting of the sales of goods in belonging to the society of Jesus without this proper oversight, other accusations included embezzling fines, extorting fees for judicial actions, judicial mock practices, issuing verbal sentences without legal procedures, denying the accused the right to defend themselves, and extorting money from impoverished citizens under the threat of imprisonment. Wow. Dr. Manuel España, acting as the official delegate of Manresa's council, also issued a report about those mismanagements to the Real Audiencia and also directly to the State Council. While Vago, the accused, himself tried to defend his honor, accusing at this time Dr. España and the corregidor to act against him because of personal animosity. He had even initiated a summary procedure against the council's delegate for inciting turmoil within the city. Here it is interesting to point out that Dr. España was not Manresa's síndico personero, but his síndico procurador general. There's an interesting difference between both positions. A síndico procurador general was chosen from a short list of 3 candidates presented by the councillors. And the síndico personero was chosen by the local populace using an indirect suffrage system of voting. So why was the delegate of the council the one leading the prosecution and not the representative of the population, the one that did that? This was because the previous personero, called Magí San Martí, had also been prosecuted by the council and the corregidores because of, and I quote, prior reports they received about the scandal and gossip, escándalo y murmuración, caused by the interactions of Magí San Martí, a chandler and confectioner from Manresa, with Monica and Teresa Font, both married women, as well as his close friendship with Fabra. It seems that these legal proceedings against San Martí also uncovered a partisan conflict within the city, in which, on one side, the council, the leaseholders of local monopolies and few clerics, faced the opposition of several members of the guilds and from the masses led by San Martí and allegedly Vago. Indeed, San Martí pleaded that this scandal, the one involving him, was devised by the opposition to go against him and prevent him from presenting again as the síndico person. Back to the main issue, the 3 reports used the real danger posed by the breaking of a scandal and its consequent public outrage as the key argument to legitimize their actions. However, the transgressions of the Alcalde Mayor were so evident that his defense was soon dismissed by the Barcelona's judges. In early March 1770, the Council of State gave permission to the Real Audiencia to prosecute Vago's administration for, of course, the maladministration of the confiscated Jesuit property and I quote, for the despotism in which he acted, collecting funds, threatening councillors and confusing instructions and orders. Quote. Consequently, they summoned him to Barcelona, where he ended up imprisoned in La Ciudadela. At first, the Council of State preferred to solve it swiftly and recommended to free him, as, and I quote, even if he had committed some excess, it had already been atoned for with such a prolonged absence from his home and position. and the council has seen him fit to return to Manresa. And I quote, "This lack attitude soon changed when Manresa's new corregidor sent another full report to the Audiencia, naming and detailing all the alleged crimes committed by Bago. With this new information, the Barcelonese court halted Bago's release and moved him to the royal prisons of the city. Once there, they renewed the prosecution, and finally, they resolved to accuse him of malversation, or peculato, in the Spanish term, of the private selling of this seized Jesuit property, keeping him in prison. 3 years later, the Audiencia finally resolved that this was one of the most serious criminal cases they had overseen, and Bago had been involved in, and I quote, "so many and such heinous crimes that, as the charges brought against him remain in his nature, he is worthy of the capital punishment or ordinary death penalty." And I quote. Unfortunately, we have not been able to prove the execution of the sentence, but we do know that he was sentenced to death. Finally, and before concluding, it's worth noting that we do know of other examples of high officials in Catalonia that were accused of corruption, though few of them faced long-lasting consequences. Just two examples of that. In 1754, the Marquis of La Mina, the prominent Captain General of the province, was anonymously accused of abusive practices, including overpricing taxes and this was particularly interesting, the illegally selling of arms license, which was also strictly forbidden. But he remained in office until his death in 1767. Similarly, the Intendente Juan Felipe Castaño was suspended in 1776 over irregularities in managing weapons factories, but he was posthumously exonerated in 1778. Both cases both examples were quietly resolved within the grounds institutions and sparking little public outcry in either Catalonia or Madrid. And to rapidly conclude, as we have seen through the broad presentation, the term of corruption scandal does not appear explicitly in historical documentation that we have treated, but as we have seen, political scandals and corruption scandals existed throughout the period studied. Regarding corruption scandals, they tended to be more frequent during the 18th century due to the absence of routinized anti-corruption framework and the lack of changes in governance that could have improved the system's integrity. After the Nueva Planta laws, this base-level political action was carried on first through the guilds, who had a critical role in challenging the administrative malfeasance of the Bourbonera municipal system during its early decades, and after the 1760s reforms, some reports also were made typically through the Síndicos Personeros and Diputados del Común, even though the use of scandal also was really present in these political clashes within the partisan council, let's say, clashes. The case of Machine San Martí is particularly illustrative of it. And also, scandals were used to prompt authorities to act against these corrupt officials. Finally, as for the politicization of Catalans in early modern period, it is evident that both the scandals and the anti-corruption mechanisms played a significant role. Anti-corruption systems contributed in forming a clear notion of the distinction between public and private spheres, as well as the responsibilities of public officials. Scandals, on the other hand, highlighted the limits of society while simultaneously serving to vindicate the political system dismantled by the Bourbon Nueva Planta, especially in terms of political participation and accountability. Thank you very much for your attention, and I yield the floor.